You know, the world needs more superheroes. So let's talk to the Mighty Ira. Welcome to the Film Threat Podcast. I am Chris Gore. I hope you're having a good day. I want to talk to you about a documentary that I think we all really need to see right now. The director is Nico Perrino is here, and the subject, Ira Glasser. The documentary is Mighty Ira, and this is a movie. If there's ever a time that this movie needs to be seen by as many people as possible, it's right now. I knew of Ira before seeing the documentary. I knew of many of the famous cases that he battled at the ACLU. But Nico, can you tell me how you came upon your subject and meeting the Mighty Ira?
Well, Chris, you're one step ahead of me because I didn't know who Ira was before 2017. This is despite doing a civil liberties work. And I do it on college campuses professionally, but I had met Ira in January of 2017 at the funeral for Nat Hentoff, who some of your older listeners and viewers might know was a longtime columnist for the Village Voice, a big jazz critic. And he had passed away that month. I went to his funeral, and one of my colleagues introduced me to two men, one of whom was Ira and one of whom was Norman Siegel, who I did not know. But my colleague introduced them to me and said that I worked for an organization that did civil liberties work on campus. And they're like, "Oh, you do what we used to do." And I said, "Well, who are you and what did you used to do?" And then I was embarrassed to find out that Ira was, of course, the executive director of the ACLU for 23 years. Norman Siegel, his colleague, was the head of the New York affiliate of the ACLU from 85 to, I believe, 2000. And that's kind of what began the journey. I invited Ira on my podcast, so to speak, the Free Speech podcast. And he said, "I might not remember much, but I'm happy to come over to your apartment and chat for 30 minutes. And 2.5 hours later, I'd gotten through, I think, 2 of my questions and figured there was a documentary in this to be made. And here we are, 2.5, almost 3 years later, and excited to have it out.
Ira, were you a little trepidatious about having, your work speaks for itself, and I was aware of many of the cases. I think a lot of them, the ACLU defended, at one time, Nazis, right? Like their freedom to march. And I remember that being the case that was always touted as something to be held against the ACLU. But I always admired the ACLU's standing firm on freedom of speech. I think we need that today more than ever. But the documentary doesn't just get into your professional achievements, but also a bit of your personal life and your ability to reach across the aisle within people of differing views. I found that so admirable, and I'm dispirited that in today's political climate, we've somehow lost the ability to do that. Can you tell me a little bit about that? I just found that one of the more compelling aspects of the doc.
Well, it is compelling when it happens. It doesn't happen universally, and I had my share of opponents over the years where it was only our own sort of restraints of civility that prevented us from going at each other's throats. And I've been known to say that sometimes the only rational response to somebody is a punch in the nose and not argument. But when you can, these are issues which, however hateful one side finds the other side's position, it's always nice when you can actually communicate on a human level with somebody. There's a tremendous tendency, I think, when you're debating these big abstract issues, to dehumanize them and to put them on a level that makes it easy to be completely dismissive of other people and what they feel and what they think. And that's a showstopper. I mean, what that means is one side has to demolish the other because there's nothing going on between them. And that's a formula for war, not resolution of disputes. So when it happens, it's very nice. And of course, it didn't happen, as I say, all the time. In fact, it probably happened less than it didn't happen. But in the examples of Bill Buckley and Ben Stern, putting those together, I thought was sort of a brilliant stroke by Nico, because they happened decades and decades apart. You know, the thing with Bill Buckley happened, you know, after I had been on his show a bunch of times and we had clashed and quite angrily, and then we had this kind of almost accidental thing happen where we were able to sort of touch on a more human level. I mean, I ended up taking him to Coney Island to the boardwalk to get a hot dog at Nathan's, and which is an experience he had never had. I ended up taking him to his first baseball game, which he had never been to in his 70s, you know, and what that sort of did, we ended up. I had dinner at his house a couple of times with other people mostly, and it ended up creating a human touch between us that was separate from the severity of our disagreements. Now, it didn't dampen down the severity of those disagreements. If you look at the firing line debates that we had during the time that we were becoming friendly, you would not be able to infer any kind of friendship. I mean, they were pretty brutal exchanges, but nonetheless, I think the human relationship that developed on the side made a difference in the debates. It meant that you were speaking to somebody who you thought of as a human being, and the same thing happened with Ben Stern decades later. I mean, I had never met Ben Stern during the Skokie case. I mean, he was a Holocaust survivor, a particularly gruesome life's experience. I mean, he was picked up as a teenager in Poland. He survived 7 concentration camps, several death marches. Near the end of World War II, he's walking barefoot in the snow for 7 miles as the Nazis attempt to kill all the prisoners. He has typhus. He's down to 70 pounds or something. I mean, this is as horrible as it can get. And there I am, years later. He's living in Skokie. He's in his 50s, or maybe a little older, and these neo-Nazi lunatics, you know, come to town to demonstrate with the swastikas on their arms. And what that must have seemed like to him is, I think, impossible for somebody who didn't have his experiences to actually imagine. So I'm, you know, in New York defending their First Amendment rights. He's in Skokie seeing what for him is a nightmare recaptured in front of him. And decades later, we meet for the first time, and I frankly didn't know how that was going to go. And the first time I meet him out in Berkeley, he's now 95. I've been retired for 20 years, and we're going to participate in a panel together to discuss a documentary about his life that his daughter has made. And his daughter drives up to meet me after I came off the plane and took a cab to where they were. And he gets out of the car. I've talked to his daughter at that point 4 or 5 times on the telephone. Never met her, but I mean, we know each other at this point. I've never met him, never spoke to him, nor I. He comes out of the car. He's this little man, you know. He has to tilt his head, you know, like this to see my face. And as I say, he's 95 years old, and he looks at me, that pugnacious jaws sticking out, sticks out his hand to shake my hand and says, "We're not going to agree, but we're going to be friends." And
I wish we could say that on social media.
Yeah, exactly. That's one of the problems with social media, is that it's text, or
right.
it's video, but it's not. There's no human touching. It's like a Zoom party without hugs,
Yeah.
and so it's a problem, because it's very easy. It's very easy when you feel strongly about something and you have somebody else you're talking to who feels strongly about something but the opposite of what you feel. It's very easy when you're not in a room together, actually facing each other, to slide into a kind of a vitriol, a kind of a viciousness that translates on paper, translates into words that you type, but is difficult when you're actually looking somebody in the eye. And so that happened with Buckley on one side of the political spectrum. It happened with Ben Stern on the other, and it happened decades apart. But the lesson of those two experiences is a very strong one, I think, particularly now when we are in such a brutally polarized state that makes it almost impossible to even converse about differences.
Well, I was going to say, I really admired your relationship with William F. Buckley. I remember watching him as a kid on various news discussion programs, and to see you take him on the subway, which he'd never been on, and to a baseball game, which he'd never been to, I thought was just, more of that, right? I feel like we're never going to solve all the great problems facing us as a society until we learn to communicate respectfully. And I'm shocked that here we are. We have more communication tools than ever before, and we don't know how to use them. And Nico, your documentary really touches on that. Tell me, like, Nico, what were some of the challenges in putting together, not only telling Ira's story, but some of these famous stories of the ACLU? Because I'd known of these stories from the news, but I never knew the sort of deeper layers of some of these stories, and you expose that through news footage and interviews. I learned sides of these stories I never saw as it was portrayed in the news. I think the way that the news portrayed many of the ACLU's famous cases is in a way that was almost incendiary, right? Like just to create division. But you really have a way of mapping out these cases where you're able to see the larger picture that must have presented some challenges.
Yeah, it did. One of the big challenges, of course, is that we're talking about things that happened decades ago, and at this point, our subjects are older or retiring or retired, like Ira. And so in order to bring our viewers back to that era, you need to find the archival footage. Our film has 500 lines of archival. It's the biggest line item in our budget. And we peeled the onion. We went to ABC, NBC, CBS, the big networks, and said, what do you have on Skokie? What do you have on Ira Glasser? What do you have on William F. Buckley? And these archival houses do a pretty good job of inputting keywords and metadata. So you can send them your keywords, and then they'll bring back everything that they have with those names in it. And that's how we found, we have a lot of Phil Donahue footage in the documentary, about 5.5 minutes of it. That's how we found Ben Stern, who is, as Ira said, a Holocaust survivor, a big feature of the documentary. He is in the audience when Phil Donahue does his big interview. David Goldberger, who was the lead attorney in the case, he's one of the people asking questions. And we knew when we went out with Ira to see his meeting with Ben Stern that we would have modern day footage of Ben Stern. We didn't know we'd have footage of him in the 70s. And that was really something that came as a part of doing the research, looking at the archival. The other way we threaded the story is I took these binders here. I've got 3 of them, very thick. And wow. What I did is I highlighted some of the, here, let's see if I can find some. I highlighted in 3 different colors every quote in the transcript that I might want to use. Red if it's something that I feel like I have to use, yellow if it's something that's in the middle, and blue if it's something that's marginal but we couldn't use. And then I put it in a 100-page Google Doc and organized it by category, and that really helped me bring out the story.
So that was more of a text edit of the film as you were going. I mean, it's, I guess the cheaper way of doing it, right? Like a text edit with so much material, 3 binders like that. That's crazy.
Yeah. Well, here's the thing. I've never made a film before, so I don't really know how to do it. But, I knew that I needed to get organized. I knew we had a lot of stories to tell, and I needed to figure out what the story should be. When I originally envisioned the film with my co-directors, Aaron Reese and Chris Maltby, I envisioned Skokie just being one portion of it, one portion of a larger story. But then when you start peeling that onion, you realize there's a lot more to the story, and it fit a good through line. It fit that the stories we wanted to tell about freedom of speech, about how it intersects with anti-Semitism and racial inequality, and why you defend even the most repugnant in society. But it also spoke a lot about talking across lines of difference, and how freedom of speech is really what forces us to have to do that. I think it was Sigmund Freud who said that civilization was created the first day that man cast a word instead of a stone. Freedom of speech is what tells us we need to leave our guns at the door. And so I feel as though all those stories kind of intertwined in the Skokie story, and of course culminated with Ira's meeting Ben Stern, and of course with the William F. Buckley story. It was Abraham Lincoln who said, "Do I not defeat my enemies when I make them my friend?" And I think there's some truth to that. And of course, Buckley talks about that in one of the segments where he says, I don't care if you're what your race is. I don't care what your religion is. I like my friends. It's a way of cutting through categorical qualifications for friendship.
That's funny you say that. I've always, it's very popular to, as Ira pointed out earlier, to dehumanize the other side wherever you stand. And it's popular to say punch a Nazi, but I just don't think that changes hearts and minds. And I would point to the example of right out of pop culture from Star Wars Return of the Jedi, when Luke Skywalker throws away his lightsaber and he turns Darth Vader, effectively a space Nazi, to the other side. I feel like that is where I would like to see us go at some point. But what really struck me about the doc, a question for both of you actually, is it seems more relevant now than ever. As I'm watching these events from the past, I think, oh, this is about now more than anything. Can you both speak to how, whether intentional or not, as you were working on this project, how it just, all of these issues we're still grappling with, and the documentary just seems so present. And Nico, also a compliment to you, is I cannot see this as being a first-time director documentary. It's so well researched. It's so well done. It's so personal. The way we meet Ira in the beginning, I don't want to give away too much about the movie, but him just giving you kind of this tour and talking to people about his life, and you just sort of slowly ease your way into the story. You don't hit, at the beginning with some of the harder stuff. It's really remarkable and touching. But please, if you wouldn't mind, both of you speak to the issue of how relevant today these issues still seem to be. I feel like we haven't stopped fighting these battles.
Ira, you want to go first?
Yeah.
Well, all right. But you know me, sometimes if you ask me my name, you come up for air an hour and a half later.
But I've spent enough time with you that I can interrupt you now. So
That's right. That's right. Well, it's not a surprise to me because although the film did not start out, as far as I know, to do something that was directly related to what's going on today, the fact is that these issues never go away. I used to have conversations with the guy who started the ACLU in 1920, Roger Baldwin, who died at the age of 97 in 1981. And I used to have these long conversations with him when I was in my 40s and he was in his 90s, one of the things that became very clear to me as I learned more about the ACLU's history and about the American history myself was that these issues replayed, sometimes in slightly different form, but that no victory ever stayed won, and that every fight you won, you had to fight for again. In 1925, when the ACLU was only 5 years old, my predecessor, Baldwin, defended John Scopes when he was arrested for teaching evolution in a biology class in Tennessee. And the ACLU was very tiny then. It had no staff lawyers. All the lawyers we had were volunteers who were in private practice. And Baldwin got the famous trial lawyer from Chicago, Clarence Darrow, to represent Scopes in what became known as the monkey trial. And it was a big case. And of course, the ACLU lost the case back then. But
became a movie too, Inherit the Wind.
It became a play and it became a movie. And although they lost the case in court, they won the case in the court of public opinion, and that began to sort of unravel the suppression of the teaching of evolution and science in general. Well, that was 1925. 56 years later, the state of Arkansas passes something called the creationism law, which doesn't prohibit you from teaching the theory of evolution, but requires in a science class that if you're going to teach the theory of evolution, you have to also teach the biblical story of creation. Really an imposition of religious doctrine into science curriculum. Well, we sued again, and Baldwin was still around. This was months before he died, and in announcing the lawsuit, instead of running the press conference myself, I asked Roger if he would run the press conference, and he did, and he was still, sharp as a tack, and he said something like, 56 years ago, we fought this kind of thing, and now here we are, we're still here, and we're going to fight it again. And then, I chimed in, yeah, and this time, Roger, we're going to win. And but one of the things that case, and you could make any number of cases in other areas, showed was that the fight for civil liberties and individual rights and equality never end because its opponents don't go away. You win and they come back fighting as strongly as you fought because they believe the opposite of what you believe, and they believe it as strongly, and they're not stupid, and they have resources, often more resources than we do, so they come back. And
can I chime in there, Ira? Because in the film, you'll notice that in the 90s, we have a clip of Ira debating with Rudy Giuliani, then the mayor of New York City, about the police practices. And we show him debating Newt Gingrich on firing line. So when Ira's saying, they come back, in this case, the same people literally come back, as we showed in that, because both of them are still in the news today and still doing what they're doing.
And, that's what always leads me to say the central strategy of civil liberties is outlast the sons of bitches. Because when Buckley retired and the firing line show that we had become a kind of a standard pair on it for many times, and the firing line show ended with his retirement, I told him, I said, I'm retiring too, Bill, but if you come back, I'm coming back. and the thing is, if it's not you, it's somebody else, because these fights are like a marathon relay race. They never get to the end of the track, but what you do is the fight goes on, and both sides hand the batons to somebody coming up, and they keep running. And the only way to evaluate it is to look at what the country was like in 1920 and look at what the country is like today and measure the progress over decades and decades and decades, much longer than the lifespan of any single individual. Because, we live for 70, 80, 90 years. That's nothing in terms of history. The freedom of the press began to struggle in the 15th century when they invented the press. The minute after they invented the press, the government started censoring it. and the same thing that happened with the internet. And it took 500 years before the First Amendment actually worked to protect freedom of the press. And it didn't always work even then. And, the Pentagon Papers case happened in the early 70s. The government was still out trying to censor stuff from being published. And so, and it never stops because there's no end to people like Trump and William Barr and Rudy Giuliani and Richard Nixon and Joe McCarthy. There's no end to those people. So there can't be an end to us either. And the fight goes on, and it takes slightly different forms. But if you're in the fight long enough, you come to recognize that it's the same fight. So it's not an accident that when you have a film that looks back 40 plus years to the Skokie case, that it has emanations and signals that reverberate with what's happening today, because that stuff doesn't change. It doesn't, no fight ever stays won. I mean, look at the right of abortion in 1973 when Roe v. Wade came down. I remember people, and we went to a party at Planned Parenthood, and everybody was drinking wine and cheese and celebrating. And finally, they had won reproductive rights for women. Well, here we are 47 years later. And what's going on in Washington now? They're having hearings for a Supreme Court justice nominee who everyone thinks if she gets on the court, Roe v. Wade is going to be reversed. Well, that may happen. And if it does happen, then it just means that you got to go back in and struggle. And if you can't win it in the Supreme Court, you have to win it in the legislatures. And if you can't win it in the legislatures, you have to win it in the court of public opinion. And the fact is, if they take away the right of women to control their own reproduction, what's going to happen? What's going to happen is conservative women who voted for the Republican majority, who want Amy Barrett to be on the Supreme Court, they're going to suddenly wake up one morning and find out, oh my God, I can't get contraceptives. Oh my God, I can't have unprotected sex. I'm talking about conservative women, because that's not an activity that only liberal women do. And so that'll change the politics again. And these struggles go on, and they go through cycles, like the stock market goes through cycles. They go up, they go down, and you just got to keep on fighting. And
that's why that's why in the documentary we begin, as we do, with Ira educating, and I don't want to give away too much, young people about some of the history surrounding Ebbett Field and Jackie Robinson breaking the color barrier. And we end the documentary with Ira speaking to young people at a conference about the history. Because, the more you know about the history, the more you know that these struggles are long and that batons need to be passed. And part of the reason I made the documentary was to share that history, but also to lend a perspective on a generation of civil libertarians, such as Ira, Norman Siegel, Philippa Strum, David Goldberger, people who, many of whom worked at the ACLU, and their approach to defending these rights and showing that these rights are neutral, these rights are valuable for all Americans, and that we shouldn't cut short these rights, extending these rights to some Americans because it meets some sort of political expediency test. Because as soon as you start deciding who gets rights based on political expediency, as Ira says, the winds tend to shift, and those rights, depending on who is in power, can be denied to you. So that was part of the process there in thinking about the arc of the documentary.
Well, it's a remarkable documentary. It's, by the time people see this. It's available on all platforms, video on demand and DVD. So look it up. Mighty Ira is the film. Ira Glasser, it's an honor to meet you, sir. And thank you so much. Nico, you inspire me from podcaster to documentarian. That's amazing. Thank you both for being on the Film Threat podcast. I also want to thank our sponsor, Storyblocks. Go to storyblocks.com/filmthreat. Great tools for indie filmmakers. Gentlemen, thank you so much.
Thanks, Russ. Appreciate it.